begin the session. As indicated in the program, this session is about um, bridging the adaptation finance gap, the role of innovative financing mechanism to attract the private sector. We have a very rich panel today, not well gender balanced but rich. But before we open the panel, we were expected to get some opening remarks, but I'm not sure the people who were to do the opening remarks are there. No, apparently. So this gives us a little bit of time to start with the panel. But before we do so, let me introduce the topic of today's discussion. We are all aware of the significant adaptation gaps that the countries are facing, especially in Africa. And we also know that the global climate financing architecture is not really prioritizing adaptation. Actually, more than 90% of the global climate finance goes to mitigation. And in Africa, for instance, most of the climate finance comes from public sector. This shows that private sector has a role to play, has an important role to play to fill the gap. But how do we ensure that private sector plays that role, that important role? For instance, there are some statistics that show that adaptation in Africa, the flow of adaptation finance in Africa is still very, very low. How can we make sure that we increase that, that adaptation finance in Africa in building the necessary infrastructure and also ensuring that we have the enabling environment for private sector to mobilize resources for adaptation? So the main question today is, how do we attract private sector into adaptation? And what are the innovative financing mechanisms to mobilize more private finance for adaptation in Africa? That's the main question that we are going to address today. And I'm going to ask my fellow panelists to introduce themselves quickly before we start the conversation. So let me start from here.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of the discussants. My name is Francis Impampi from Zambia. I am the NDA for Zambia under the GCF, also the designated authority under the Adaptation Fund. I'm currently sitting in the Ministry of Green Economy and Environment. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Maria Tapia. I'm leading the Climate Finance Program at the Global Center on Adaptation.
Good afternoon, my name is Gareth Phillips. I'm the Manager of Climate and Environmental Finance at the African Development Bank.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Cinzia Luceno. I'm from the European Investment Bank, where I'm responsible for the bank's approaches to adaptation resilience across all our regions of operations.
Hello everyone, my name is Hamza Tiber. I'm from the Boston Consulting Group. I work on climate and sustainability from our Casablanca office.
Good afternoon, my name is Hamid Asifar. I'm Head of Asset Managers at Invesco based in London. I'm leading a climate adaptation finance initiative, and I'm happy to be here to share with you our thoughts from the private sector.
Thank you very much. Let me also introduce myself. I am Alhamdou Dorsuma. I'm the Acting Director, Climate Change and Green Growth at the African Development Bank. I am your moderator today. So let's start with maybe two presentations. Maria, you have a presentation? Is it a PowerPoint presentation? Okay, Great. So Maria is going to make a quick presentation on raising private sector capital and institutional investors through different financing solutions. You have the floor.
Thank you. So just to put a little bit of the context of why it's important to bring the private finance, the private sector to finance adaptation, we need to put the numbers, and we need to repeat those numbers over and over, because adaptation finance keep being the uncomfortable guest in the room in the finance forums. So we need to realize that for Africa, Africa needs about 52 billion in adaptation commitments annually, and they are only receiving 11.4 billion. So the gap is at 41.3 billion and needs to be met. And given the financial situation of African governments after COVID and now with the Ukraine war, the prices are going up, and their fiscal space is very limited for them to invest in adaptation measures. So they need to bring the private sector. And if we are still looking about how much of that global climate finance flows come from the private sector, it's only 3%, meaning most of the climate finance is still being financed by governments. Most of it, 41% from development finance institutions. So we really need to, and from those development finance institutions, 41% is financing from commercial loans, and 32% on concessional loans. Let's go back again. Africa cannot take more debt, and we need to have a better mix of how to blend those public resources with private sector to make a business case for adaptation finance. So in a partnership with the Africa Development Bank, last year we launched the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, which aims to mobilize 25 billion of adaptation finance in Africa by 2025. We initially partnered with the African Development Bank because the African Development Bank is the bank for Africa, but also we have been, GCA has been signing different partnership agreements, and an example is with the EIB. We have also signed a memorandum of understanding with EIB to also start looking at how can we collaborate in bringing financing solutions in adaptation in those countries that we all have the same focus, which is Africa again. And with also with the private sector, in the 2 weeks ago in Finance in Common, GCA signed a memorandum of understanding with Invesco Asset Management, also to try to bring directly the private sector into the discussion and try to broker that relationship between the public and the private sector. So within the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, we have different pillars. The one that I'm here to talk about is the Innovative Financial Initiative pillar, which has two main objectives. First, to increase the supplies of adaptation finance. This means that we need to greatly enhance the mobilization of adaptation finance from both domestic and international and public and private sources. And at the same time, we need to enhance the access to climate finance. What does that mean? We need to enhance the capacity of those actors that want to reach the international climate funds. So there are different international climate funds. We have the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, the GEF, the CIPS, but for certain African countries it's very difficult to access those funds because building the climate rationale of those funding proposals is very hard. So we need to support them, support their capacities, and through the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, we are doing that. We also recently published our second edition of the State and Trends Finance in Africa. And in that report you will have some sections, some different chapters, and one specifically on there's a chapter on finance where we put here, we categorize the level of different actors that are available to finance adaptation, and it goes from the highest concessionality to the less concessional or commercial basis. And we need to start identifying those actors depending on the project that we are looking to finance. We also need to understand that each of these actors have different level of risk tolerance. So the report also shows the level of risk tolerance per actor. So depending on how risky is the project, we choose the actor, and we try to find that de-risking mechanism to meet the different risk appetites of the investors that we are looking at. And there it comes about the instruments. So we need to source different type of instruments. So it's not only a loan, it can be a combination of loan, grants, or guarantees. It depends on the project, but the report also showcases different type of instruments that can be used to finance adaptation. These are kind of 3 examples that currently exist in Africa and that have adaptation components. All of them are bonds. Bonds, it has become an instrument that is very well accepted by international institutional investors. It is just that to get there, to issue a green bond, and then to get to issue a green bond with adaptation components, there are a lot of steps to be taken. And some of those steps are related to a taxonomy that needs to be used to define what is an adaptation project, and the metric that needs to be reported. And what GCA is leading right now in terms of innovative financial instruments is, for example, supporting the sovereign sustainable bond of the government of Cote d'Ivoire. And for that, we are doing a climate public expenditure review to identify the adaptation expenditures that the government already have, so that they can allocate those expenditures in the use of proceeds of the bond, and we elevate the share of adaptation investments within the green bond framework. But also, again, we are working with asset managers. So with this signing of the MOU with Invesco Asset Management, which is a large asset manager, and Invesco will have the time to present themselves, but we are looking at different blended finance solutions to scale adaptation finance and mobilizing institutional investors in the most vulnerable countries. So with that, I will pass the floor to Gareth, who is co-leading with me the IFI pillar of the AAAP.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you very much. Gareth, you have 3 minutes to introduce a very important subject, actually. Let me mention the title of your presentation on innovative financial mechanism from the African Development Bank. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. So in 3 minutes, I'm a little bit restricted on what I can do. But let me just highlight some of the challenges that we have around mobilizing finance for adaptation. One of the biggest problems I find is the momentum behind the focus on mitigation. There's a huge interest now in companies adopting net zero targets and more momentum in the carbon markets for emission reductions. And this, unfortunately, is taking attention away from opportunities to finance adaptation. What we see is that the increased focus, we see companies adopting these net zero targets and they think that that's all they need to do to contribute towards climate change. But we don't see anybody adopting things like sort of positive adaptation goals as a target, or climate adapted supply chains and so on. This is the kind of thing we would like to see coming forward that would help the private sector start putting the same kinds of money into adaptation as they're doing for mitigation. So we want, because we want to access this money. This is effectively it's grant money or performance-based payments, performance guarantees, and so on, that companies are willing to pay for mitigation, but they don't understand that they could also pay that for adaptation. One of the reasons for that is that there's a poor understanding of adaptation. Is not helped by the fact that we don't have standard definitions. We don't need standard definitions for adaptation, I don't think. But for many investors and private sector companies, that's something of a barrier for them. Some of the other problems we have around adaptation projects is that they are context specific and small. Because often they're to be implemented by communities, cooperatives, micro, small and medium enterprises on a local scale. Unbelievably, at least for me, I read in a NEPAD report that there are an estimated 44 million micro, small and medium enterprises in sub-Saharan Africa. So even if just 1% of those entities wanted to engage in climate finance, that would be nearly 500,000 entities that want to access climate finance. And we don't have any climate finance architecture that can deal with that scale of activity. When they want to borrow small amounts of money as well, it makes it more complicated. We also have many women and youth who want to access money, but they're unbankable. They can't raise credit because they don't have collateral, they don't own land, and so on. We also need project developers to provide technology and financial support, or project developers need technology and financial support, and they need to borrow relatively small amounts of money, and that's a challenge because as financial institutions the transaction costs are high. So we're not really interested in lending small amounts of money. We do so through lines of credit to local commercial banks and so on, but not at nearly enough scale. Excuse me. Not at nearly enough scale to achieve the kinds of mobility that we need. And then for women, again, only 23% of them can access credit, and when they access credit in local currency, they face prohibitively high interest rates, and the problem is, as I mentioned, is they want to borrow relatively small amounts of money. Now, I think if Alhandu is serious about my 3 minutes, I don't have time to go through the mechanisms. Speed up. Okay, so the adaptation benefits mechanism is one instrument that we're working on that's designed to help channel finance from developed country private sector actors to developing country private sector actors. And it's important to understand this distinction between the different types of private sector, because we talk generally about the private sector, but we want the developed country private sector to provide finance towards the costs of adaptation projects that will be implemented by developing country private sector. Developing country private sector actors have all of the other ingredients that you need for an adaptation project. They have the land, the indigenous technical knowledge, the entrepreneurial skill, the labor, they are the custodians of biodiversity, and they're willing to take risk, but they don't have money. The private sector in the developed countries have the money, but they don't have any of the other ingredients. So we need them to come together. And the adaptation benefits mechanism helps to facilitate that. And there are two key documents that are to be created. First is the registered project. So it goes through a process to get officially approved. That's like appraisal in a bank. So the project gets registered, and then you need an adaptation benefit supply agreement, which is a legally binding agreement with the purchaser in the developed country who says, I will pay you this much money on delivery of the certified adaptation benefits. Now, if you can get both of those documents, then you can borrow money from a green bank, from a local commercial bank, from a line of credit. That's our job as MDBs, to make that money available. And that would enable money to start flowing into adaptation projects. And we think that we could do that at scale. We could literally have thousands of bilateral agreements between funds, between private sector companies in the developed world, signing agreements, purchase agreements or supply agreements with project developers in the developing world. So that's a little bit about the adaptation benefits mechanism. If you want to know more, we're having a stakeholder consultation event here at 5 o'clock on Friday evening, followed by cocktails. So you're very welcome to come and join us to learn more about the ABM. Very briefly, we have a Green Banks initiative, which is looking at creating national climate change funds or green banks that would lend money to adaptation and mitigation activities at a national scale, possibly in local currency. They can mobilize local currency, diaspora revenues, and so on. So very interesting, building on the experience from Rwanda and also in a lot of developed countries where green banks have been critical in providing funding for these activities. And just very briefly, we have a couple of other instruments, ADRIFI, which is a disaster risk insurance mechanism to help build and finance insurance for farmers against disaster, because farmers are very conservative. They don't want to invest money unless they're certain they'll get a return. So they need insurance, but there's very little access to it on the African continent. And we're also developing a small medium enterprise facility that will help support green investments in small and micro enterprises that contribute towards NDCs. Thank you very much indeed. Alhamdulillah, back to you.
Thanks so much, Gareth, to take us through this very important and innovative initiative, the adaptation benefit mechanism. Now, let me turn to the panel. We still have 3 key speakers, no, 4, to address very specific questions. I'm going to start with Francis from Zambia. I know that Zambia is very active in the area of climate finance mobilization. You said that you are the NDA for the Green Climate Fund in Zambia. My question to you is, what is the experience from your country in mobilizing climate finance, especially innovative climate financing mechanism? Any experience, any lessons you want to share from your country's perspective in order to further mobilize climate finance for Africa?
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have been in this space for some time, and we've been trying to see how we can perfect the act. It hasn't been an easy road, but I think we are getting there. Like what Gareth said, the aspect of mitigation has not been a very difficult one. But when you get to the adaptation aspect, it becomes very complicated to make a business case. In adaptation, also the quantums sometimes are so low that no commercial bank wants to venture into that and lend money to farmers, especially if they are not coming together and move as a group. So it has been a bit of a challenge, but from experience, what we have done is we've been working with a number of farmers in what they come into a cooperative and they try to work as a team so that increases in terms of the quantums that they are looking for. And also when you are bringing in measures, what is it that you are going to do, or what is it that they are going to do which is going to make them qualify to get money that we will deem to be channeled to green investment. You need first to help them. The easier case is that of non-forest products, also the issue of farmers. I think for Zambia this has been ongoing for some time, where we've been working with communities in the non-forest products, also in the non-timber products, and also the aspect of climate smart agriculture. We have in the southern part of Zambia, where the effects of climate change have been adverse, and also parts of eastern part of Zambia. And in these areas we've been working with some entities that have brought farmers together, and the farmers have been given extension services, they've been helped, but more than that, they've been helped to gain or get resources from microfinance entities, and they've been able to invest those resources in measures that have been helpful to them to become more productive. But we are trying to work with the banks to see whether we can scale that up so that we start having huge numbers, and also we cast the net wider so that we bring a lot of farmers into that, and we start having much more impact. And also we believe that when we have that greater impact, the ripple effect from there will be much more, because when you're looking at the downstream, you help the farmers in terms of supply. the input supply program, if it's dealt with, you look at the research aspect, you improve the seed varieties. When you come to the midstream, you're looking at the aggregators, those buyers, you address that. You also have the producers at the end that are going to process now what they are getting. So you will have addressed the downstream, the midstream, and the upstream. And that way you are trying to create a business case in this aspect. Also, the other thing that we've come to learn is that we need to target specific value chains if we are to create impact. So we need to make sure that we look at specific value chains and see if we start with the value chain up to its completion, what impact are we creating? How does it make a business case? So the bottom line is that we need to make a business case out of this to ensure that the financiers see it to be relevant to finance. But also when you're looking at financials, it's the question of what are the requirements. I think Gareth in his presentation touched on one of the things that we've been struggling with, the issue of security. If the farmers are going to borrow money from the commercial market, what are the interest rates? Are the farmers able to pay back? In an event that there's a drought or there's a flood, is there insurance? I think my colleagues with me from Zambia have been looking at this. There's the issue of the insurance that is gaining momentum, which I think has been welcomed by the farmers, and this also is making them to come out and go forth and be able to engage the financial institutions so that they can tap into the available resources. But also, we've been also working on the issue of the Green Bank, and we have been trying to get some of our institutions accredited so that they can deal with the specific issues that are specific to Zambia. I think we have two commercial banks that we have one commercial bank that has been accredited with the GCF, and also the Development Bank that has been accredited. So going forward, we are trying to see, especially for the Development Bank, what are some of the de-risking instruments that they are going to put in place to try and attract these farmers to come forth and be able to get the resources and create impact in terms of their production. So basically that is where we are as a country. We have learned some lessons. We are trying to build on those lessons and see where we move from here.
Thank you very much, Francis, for lessons learned in Zambia on mobilizing climate finance. And you mentioned the experience you are having with green banks and getting some of your institutions in Zambia to be accredited to the Green Climate Fund. Let me now move to Cynthia from the European Investment Bank.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? The audio is not great. The temperature is so cold. It's ridiculous. Anyway, thank you. I struggled to hear what you said, but I think you gave me some food for thoughts in terms of what the NDBs can really do to support the engagement of private sector, particularly on adaptation. I think if you allow me, I'll come up with maybe 3-4 points, but closer. Okay, closer. Here we go. So 3 ways in which the European Investment Bank and honestly NDBs in general can really support the engagement of the private sector in adaptation. I'm going to start with a very simple one, which is first of all ensure that private sector entities really are adapted to climate change. That's the easiest part, all right? They have to look at physical climate risk. They have to ensure that their assets and their services are adapted, that they don't lock their clients into climate vulnerability either. So that's the easy part. NDBs have, systems in place to help clients in doing that, even private sector clients. Second way is a bit harder, of course, and it's the de-risking. And that's a critical role that multilateral development banks have to play when it comes to really trying to engage private sector. Most of us are public institutions. We have public resources that can really be used to mobilize private sector. We have a de-risking role. we can provide a buffer risk for investments, particularly in adaptation solution. And this is one element that I think is really, really important, and is one way in which private sector can really play a role in the field of adaptation in dealing with the impacts of climate change. It's all to do with technology, products and services, adaptation solutions. Private sectors have the skills, the entrepreneurships, the knowledge, the ability, their creativity to come up with new ideas, new solutions. So banks like the EIB and multilateral development banks should absolutely support new entrepreneurs in developing technologies, products and services for adaptation. And we can do that because we are very good at de-risking, okay? So that's the second way. Then there's a third way. That's really hard, I'm afraid. So I went from the very simple to the very hard, which is trying to support the development of favorable investment environment for the private sector. And this is very much about working with public sector, so with governments, to develop regulations and policies that can really help private sectors on adaptation solutions. Not so easy, but many examples across the world, in Africa, in Latin America, and even in the EU, on how NDBs can really do this, okay? Without the right regulations, without the right policy, without the favorable environment, there is very little chance for the private sector to really engage in adaptation finance. Those are three ways. There are many, many other ways, but those are the three key ways. I would say one more word. Gareth, you mentioned the need to have common standards, common understanding. That's something that the NDBs can do very, very well as well. With all the work that we are doing on adaptation finance, we can really help create that common understanding of what is an adaptation investment, what is an adaptation activity that need to be financed. And we do that constantly. We engage in a debate with all financial institutions to really create that common understanding. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, for those three key ways of mobilizing private sector finance for adaptation from MDB's perspectives. Let me now move to Hamza from the Boston Consulting Group. Hamza is going to maybe address the question of the new approaches that are available out there to mobilize private sector finance for adaptation.
Thank you, Alhamdulillah. I hope you can all hear me well. So I can lift it? Okay. All right. So is it better now? All right. So it's at BCG we have a fairly simple theory of change, and we think that in order to attract, in order to get to resource mobilization and capital allocation for adaptation, we need first to do some homework, and in particular we need to change the outlook of the private sector on what it means to invest in adaptation, and we think that to do that we need to reset the baseline and help the private sector better understand the value at risk. So basically, many companies and investors out there think that they have a choice between a business as usual scenario where nothing happens, they don't invest in resilience and adaptation, and the scenario where they do have to incur additional costs. But the reality is that if you do nothing, the cost, inaction has a very high cost. And so that's what we're trying to do, to highlight that in the absence of preventive measures of adaptation investment, you are actually putting your assets and your supply chains, you're putting a lot of value at risk. And so to do that, for example, we recently worked with the Lagos government, where we used some advanced analytics to run climate models to understand really in a very granular way the physical climate risks, and then we run a series of econometric models to translate those risks into socioeconomic impacts. And by doing that, we a number of things start to happen. For example, we've had conversations with some of the top CEOs in the state of Lagos, which, by the way, Lagos is the largest city in Africa, as you all know, but it's going to be the largest city in the world around the 2050s. And if it were a country, it would be maybe the fifth economy on the continent. And so when we were talking with the CEOs that happen to be in an area that is highly at risk from sea level rise, Etiosa, we noticed that they then understand the value at risk, and they are willing to invest and think innovatively about how they could do that. And so they've been thinking about pooling their resources to jointly invest, etc. But anyway, the point here is that we can approach adaptation investment from a risk management perspective, but also, as my colleague was saying, from a more opportunistic perspective. And we also believe that this is also an important angle that we need to look at. And then I wanted also to mention a few innovative ideas that we're exploring. For example, we're thinking about how maybe we could better embed physical risk exposure into accounting standards, and how we could value PCRs into balance sheets as liabilities, for instance, and resilient investments could be then valued as assets. And so we think that changing the way you look at your balance sheet accounting could change potentially how you finance these balance sheets. And at the end of the day, accounting standards have evolved in the past and will continue to evolve in the future to reflect the new realities that we will be dealing with as climate impacts increase. So, I mean, these are exploratory discussions and reflections, but I think that they're very promising. And so very concretely at BCG, we're doing a number of things. First of all, we're launching a blended finance team to drive work with public and private financiers who are looking at ways to better structure, deploy, and measure the impact of blended finance vehicles. And we help investors conduct market scans, again, to structure blended vehicles, and due diligence, as well as impact assessment. So, and we're already partnering with a number of actors. We've been having some initial conversations with DFIs, but we're also talking to the Investor Leadership Network, to the Sustainable Market Initiative with the Rockefeller Foundation. We're also, we joined recently the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment. So, and the World Economic Forum as well. So there are many people out there in the private sector that are trying to better understand how to think about investment in adaptation, and we're there with them to help them have this transformative journey towards building more resilient businesses and societies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hamza, for the experience from the Boston Consulting Group. Let me now turn to Hamid to speak about the experience from Invesco on mobilizing adaptation finance from private sector perspective. You have been already mentioned by Armaria.
Yes.
I think you have a lot to say on that, so the floor is yours. 3 minutes, please.
Yeah, I'm not sure a lot in 3 minutes is kind of logical, but I'll try. Maybe a few words about Invesco, for those who don't know us. So we are a global asset manager. We manage about 1.5 trillion in assets across the globe. We have strong capabilities in emerging markets with investment management teams present locally, analyzing projects and trying to bring value to their investees. We have been working with several DFIs, private sector entities, corporations, to find a solution to the challenges that climate adaptation investing is posing. First one is around private capital mobilization, and the second is around scalability of adaptation investments in developing markets. So we brought to market a fund concept, and we are hoping to launch a fund in the upcoming weeks, focusing on climate adaptation in developing markets, because we do believe, back to Hamza's point, we do believe that investing in adaptation can help you avoid economic loss over the long run. It can bring impact to the local communities, and it can have benefits, social and environmental benefits, right, from an ESG perspective as well. How to do that? You need to basically to focus on addressing the systems that are most impacted by the physical risk, right, of climate change. So on the water sector, for example, food security, investing in agricultural technologies, in food technologies to make our food sustainable, early warning systems to mitigate and prevent local communities on sea level rise in coastal zones, etc. So there are projects. We had to basically break the kind of myth around adaptation investment. There are no bankable projects in the market. There are, right? We've done the work from a portfolio management perspective, and there are a lot of projects out there that we can invest in from day one. But when you want to mobilize private capital, we want to mobilize the biggest pension funds out there, sovereign wealth funds, largest asset managers, going back to Cynthia's point, you need to de-risk. Those guys won't go and invest in those markets normally, right? But if you bring the risks to certain levels, acceptable levels, that would make those investments commercially viable, then they can consider, right? So that's why we are thinking about like a blended finance. I think it's a good way to like go and attract those investors. So building a junior kind of equity tranche to de-risk investments for senior holders, institutional clients, is the right way to do this, right? There are guarantees, insurance products out there that you could use as well, but it's a single project by project basis, and that won't help like the scalability that we are targeting. In terms of like as well how to invest in the market, which are the instruments that you can use day one. If you are thinking about Africa, we've seen a lot of equity funds in Africa shutting down after 2 years, right? Because the market structure is not developed enough to build equity funds. You have a lot of private equity funds out there as well, but they invest in single projects. So you are not as well addressing the scalability and amplifying those type of solutions across the boards in many countries. And you all know that in Africa, for example, 54 countries, every country is different, accessibility of investment is different, so you need to be a little bit innovative, right? Debt is pretty much the easiest way to do it, but you need to be innovative in the way you bring those debt instruments to market. Green bonds are great, but they are not still developed. They focus on mitigation, mainly issued by developed markets players, and they focus on energy and transport. So there is a lot to do in that space, but we are working to bring solutions. I can't share the secret sauce here, but we have found very credible solutions to scale up adaptation investments and channel some of the flows to the most vulnerable regions to climate change, mainly Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we heard a lot from the speakers. We have 15 minutes to open the floor for questions and comments from you. Let me check who is going to go first. Yes, you have the floor. Can we have a microphone?
Yes, sorry, I have a very small voice. So I'm Virginie from McDonald. We actually are working with CCRI on the BICRAM methodology, looking at how we integrate physical climate risk. You can't hear? Is it better? Okay. Sorry. So I'm Virginie from McDonald. We are working with CCRI on the physical climate resilience investment methodology, where we're looking at how we integrate physical climate risk into the valuation of infrastructure assets and integrating those aspects into risk-adjusted returns for those assets. I have a question really to, I guess, not particular to one speaker, but all of you. So adaptation, is sounds very complicated, yeah, and we know it's much more complicated than mitigation, yeah. And one of the challenges are the metrics. How do we measure adaptation investments? What is adaptation? And the second question is, how do we generate cash flows? Because obviously, when we talk about private investors, you know, they want to generate profits and cash flows. So where are the cash flows? How do we make adaptation much more easier to grasp when we're talking about developing countries, a developing country context, when governments have to think, okay, how we mobilize private capital, knowing all those challenges around definitions, around metrics, around market signals, around regulatory frameworks. How do we make this to happen in the developing country context? And what are the steps a country can take just to develop that market? And obviously, most of you provided some bits and pieces around that, but you know, if there's a way, you know, like 5 steps a country can follow to think about adaptation, finance, and private investment, you know, what would those be?
Thank you. Let's take another, maybe a couple of questions from the floor, and then ask the panelists to address them. Otherwise, let me now turn to the panel. Who is going to start? I think we got several questions here. Cynthia?
I can start with a question on what is an adaptation investment. The NDBs have worked quite for some time on trying to understand better what makes an adaptation investment and how to track the finance associated with that investment. And we have our own approach to do that, the joint NDB methodology on tracking adaptation finance. And your question is very timely because we just updated the methodology and we will be presenting it on Saturday at 1 o'clock here, in fact, in this pavilion. So I invite you to join us to learn a little bit more on how we NDBs define adaptation investment and how we track the finance associated with these investments. And just to give you a little bit of flavor of what that might be, it's really not rocket science, agreed, but it's very much about being clear about what type of activities are employed in the context of a project to reduce well-identified vulnerabilities, and that's all it is about, really, protect people and livelihoods and assets. And there are activities that, of course, are very incremental, very small, to do with just improving assets, like a road, like a bridge. But there are also activities that are very transformational, and very much about transforming an economy, a sector, a city, to reduce vulnerabilities, the underlying reasons for vulnerabilities, and towards a more resilient path for development. So I invite you to come on Saturday at 1 to hear all about what it is that NDBs consider an adaptation activity and how they track the finance associated with that.
Okay.
I think there are 2 more questions. Yes, I'll leave other colleagues to.
Maybe you can ask your neighbor, Garrett, can you take the question on how do we generate cash flows for adaptation?
Yes, thank you very much. Let me just add a word on the metrics. So Cinzia talked about how the MDBs are identifying the metrics. In the example that I gave of the adaptation benefits mechanism, not to be confused with the MDB accounting, but there our approach to what adaptation metrics is derived from the opportunity that host countries have to specify their adaptation needs in their NDCs and their national adaptation plans. So what I mean there is that if a country says, you know, we have 50,000 farmers who need to transition to climate resilient agriculture, then if we can implement a project that helps farmers transition to climate resilient agriculture, we can report the finance that we've done, that we've used for that activity as adaptation finance. So under the adaptation benefits mechanism, that is a way that we would work. Then in terms of the cash flows, again, specifically in the context of the adaptation benefits mechanism, we are looking for donors and private sector entities in developed countries who are willing to pay for the outputs, outcomes, or impacts associated with those activities. So through the adaptation benefit mechanism, we identify the financing gap, and we're looking for somebody who says, okay, I'm going to pay that gap because I want to be associated with those outputs or those impacts, and I want to report them as my contribution towards this country's development and low carbon climate resilient development. So that's where the cash flows come from, the sale or the provision of the certified adaptation benefits, and you use those cash flows to pay back the loan that you took from a green bank or from a line of credit from a local commercial bank, and you make some money, that the private developer makes some money on the way, but not, it's not a killing. It's not like the carbon markets where you seek to maximize the profit. Here you look to make a reasonable profit and pay back the loan. And finally on the market, again, I think the market it can be very confusing and it can be quite negative in the context of these sorts of activities. So we're positioning the adaptation benefit mechanism as a non-market instrument. So the certified adaptations, benefits that we're creating are not transferable. The only thing you can do with them is retire them and report the outputs, outcomes, or impacts associated with them. You can sell the cancellation code to somebody else, but there's no speculation, there's no wholesale market in it. So it's not a market instrument, there's no benchmark price. And that's a very interesting concept that actually deserves a lot more attention to see how it impacts upon private sector engagement. Thanks.
Thank you, Gareth. Hamza, you want to add something on that?
Yeah,
but somebody needs to answer the very first question on how adaptation is so complicated than mitigation. But yeah,
well, so
maybe I will come back to you on that later on. Yeah.
Well, let me, I mean, it's complicated, of course, but there is a simple metric, as my co-panelist was saying. It's basically the number of lives that you protect. And I think that maybe putting people at the center is a very good metric. But I wanted to speak to the cash flow question. I mean, certainly there are cash flow generating activities. You can think of maybe carbon offsetting and regenerative agriculture, things like that. But the point I was trying to make earlier in my intervention is that you have to think about investment in adaptation as a way to avoid losses, future losses of cash flow. So there is a value at risk, and by investing in adaptation today, you're protecting your future cash flows also. That's also a way to look at it. Just a simple point.
Thank you, Hamza. Anything to add from that side on the questions? Yes.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, my name's Sonia Dunlop from E3G, Third Generation Environmentalism. We're a climate change think tank. And my question is specifically on one of many climate impacts, which is that of extreme heat, which has one of many solutions, which is that of really sustainable and efficient cooling technologies in buildings, in transport, in the food chain, in the agricultural sector, and so on. And I was just wondering what you all think we need to do to make sure that we integrate really sustainable and really efficient cooling technologies of all kinds into all our work as part of our efforts on adaptation, and what kind of financing that might require. Thank you.
Thank you. Edith?
Hello. Hello. Okay. Hello, can you hear me? Okay, great. I think this has been a very interesting panel. And what I've noticed is that when we started with what you're sharing in Zambia, hello? When we started with what you're sharing in Zambia, you were looking at sort of like the micro level where farmers are trying to build resilience and work on agriculture, for example. When we came to Invesco, which is a private sector entity, so to speak, you seem to have found a very good niche of supporting very innovative adaptation investments. You clearly said you cannot share at this point, but it will be very interesting to hear what kind of projects are likely to attract very high-end investors where you have a blend of instruments that can attract them. I think would be very interesting to hear from you, because we seem to have continuum of small projects, but also you can get to scale and really attract the private sector. It would be very interesting to hear that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edith. Let's take the last question from Mark.
Hi, everyone. I think my question might be the same as Edith's, but formulated in a slightly different way, which is, it would be useful to hear from you each an example of adaptation in the private sector which you think is most demonstrative of the value of adaptation. Because a lot of the time the adaptation movement is talking to one another, and everyone perhaps in this room knows what they think, why it is so important. But when you're having conversations with people who perhaps don't know what adaptation is, you have to start from square one. Which private sector, when you're having conversations with the private sector about what adaptation is, what examples do you use which are most powerful in showing the value of adaptation? And perhaps this, you know, whether it's something which Hamid is working on or other kind of examples you've come across. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Let me get back to the panel. Yes, Cynthia?
Can you hear me? Yes. I have at least 3 examples that just came up to my mind. So first of all is the Emerging Market Climate Action Fund. So we set up a fund with the Alliance Global, and it's a fund that raises money from investors to develop technologies across the globe for adaptation and mitigation. So it's for both purposes. And the first project that this fund is supporting is actually cooling. And it's about cold chain in Kenya. It's about developing very simple, cost-effective methods to transport and store food with a very small shelf life and pharmaceutical products so that they can be maintained in good conditions and transported. Sounds trivial, right? As so fundamental. So this fund is actually working with local entrepreneurs to develop these very simple cooling cold chain systems for food and pharmaceutical products in Kenya. So that's an example of how something very, very big, like a fund between the EIB and Alliance Global, can support very local entrepreneurs to develop technologies that work for adaptation. Okay? And to give you an example, it's so important because something like 90% of food in Kenya does not get any cool storage. You can imagine what that means, especially under a scenario of increased heat and extreme heat. Okay? So that's one example. I can give you another example on insurance, climate protection, climate risk protection. Very similar structure. We work with Blue Orchard. So it's a large fund of funds actually. And the ultimate purpose is to support farmers and develop micro insurance targeted to local farmers for climate risk protection. So to protect farmers, their assets, and their yields against the impacts of climate change, particularly extreme events, of course.
Okay.
And that's all across Africa.
Thank you. We only have 3 minutes. Let me start with Hamid. I hope you are going to disclose your approach.
Maybe not today, but I can give you some how the private sector thinks about like adaptation investments in general. So when we talk to our clients in the private side of things, we talk about thematic funds. We don't talk about blended finance and all these fancy words that I learned from Maria on the public financial institutions. We have different jargon that we use. So we think about thematic funds, and thematics are very different. You have water, right? Water security and management. You have technologies that are supporting agriculture and the food systems, sustainable food, right? You have like technologies, information technologies, right? Like early warning systems that can help communities like prevent themselves from like catastrophes and disasters. So those type of like sub-thematics, right? You have a lot of like bonds in the markets, at nature-based bonds, right? Resilience bonds. So we are seeing like a lot of like acronyms that are developed for the purpose of attracting the private sector already, right? It just it's very different. The problem with Africa is the market access, and that's a structural problem, right? You need to originate different instruments, try and learn from what's existing, and try to build something similar that can help channel those flows towards this continent, right? And what we need to do as a private sector entity with our clients is to build the investment case for Africa. For example, at Invesco, we've written a report on Africa. We do believe that it's going to be the story of this century, the economic and investment story of this century, because of the natural, like the human resources, right? The working population in Africa by the end of the century will represent probably 40%, right, of the global working population. It's huge. You also have, the continent has also the
Hamid, we don't have enough time, so if you can wrap
maybe we
up.
can do it like an aside.
And we are freezing in that
Yeah,
room. We have
I'm
to
just
go,
trying to talk to warm up my body, so.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me turn to Maria and Francis. You haven't spoken yet. Is there any question you want to address? Francis, yes?
Yes, please. I think I just wanted to add to what was given regarding the value of adaptation. I think the most significant aspect when you're looking at value of investing in adaptation is that you are safeguarding the assets. I think we've talked about the issue of food security. We are talking about pharmaceuticals. If we do not invest in adaptation, the basis for all these things is wiped away. You are not creating resilience in the system, so you will have no production at the end of the chain. So you invest in the downstream up to the last mile so that you protect your assets. I think that is one thing that we need to underscore, and that should trigger the issue of technology. So what do we do in terms of technology to address some of the issues? How do we design the markets? What are some of the structural barriers that we need to address? We look at the policy. So all these things put together, they should be able to motivate those of us who are players both at multilateral and also at national level to come together and come up with ideas and innovations that would speak to this challenge that we are currently experiencing.
Thank you. Maria, last word.
So, what I see is that there are two phases of the story. One is the public sector needs to put out there the pipeline. And for that to happen, most of the time the government has already expenditures related on adaptation, on climate risk. It is just that they need to identify them and start tagging it. And that's when we go into green budget tagging exercises and climate expenditure reviews. But on the other side, these budgets and this transparency on the budgets, they have to make them visible for the private sector to invest. When Invesco approached us to support them on ideas on an adaptation fund, I asked them, what do you have in your portfolio with these characteristics? So I gave them a simple taxonomy of what an adaptation project would look like. Hamid went back to its portfolio management team, and they look into their assets that they already own. Most of them were technology-related, water-related projects, so they already have assets, adaptation assets in their investment, in their assets under management. They just don't report the metric of impact because for them it's just an investment that has a return. Now, by setting up this possible blended finance solution in the future and to make it visible and to be able to label as an adaptation fund, they will need to work on the metrics to report. And this is some work that they are doing with their ESG department and in collaboration with other partners like us to make sure that whatever they put out in the future is completely aligned with the country's adaptation priorities, and but also with very clear metrics to report impact.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Give a very big round of applause to our panelists. It has been a very engaging conversation on a very topical issue, mobilizing private sector finance for adaptation. Thank you for your participation.